I'm Laura Smits, President of the League of Women Voters of Connecticut, and I welcome you to our evening of Connecticut Women of Color Suffragist Research Fellowship presentation. This is a very exciting time that we are in, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening. It's an interesting time. We were mourning the passing of the first woman who become Secretary of the State of the United States, Madeleine Albright. And as we celebrate the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. So we're kind of in between these two incredible events, and it's definitely Women's History Month, and we are here to celebrate that. Our presentation this evening will be Catherine Angelica and Brittany Yancey. Catherine will start, and what we're going to do is we're going to have Catherine start, and then Brittany will go, and then after that, we'll have a question and answer session, and you can put your question and answer into the question and answer if you'd like. Otherwise, you can just use the raised hand function, and we will unmute your mic and allow you to appear on video to ask your question directly. Totally your choice. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for being with us on this incredibly important league event. Catherine Angelica is a PhD student in history at the University of Connecticut. She has an MA from the University of Chicago and a BA from Boston University. Ms. Angelica's research will take an intersectional approach to the research of Black women's organization and activism in Connecticut. This work on Black suffragists in Connecticut will serve as an important step in reshaping the genealogies of suffrage history, including the influences of abolitionism, labor reform, and community activism. Brittany Yancey is an assistant professor of humanities at Goodwin University. She's completing her doctorate from the University of Connecticut in 20th century US history. Her fellowship will continue the research she did for the Work Must Be Done Digital Archives project that is on the Connecticut Historical Society website. This fellowship will result in the public dissemination of new research and tell a more complete history about women of color suffragists, anti-suffragists, and activists. Thank you for joining us. Take it away, Katie.
All righty. Okay, success. All right. Well, hello, everybody out there. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I want to begin by extending a thank you to the Connecticut League of Women Voters for their support over the last year in this research and the broader dissertation project this is connected to. And as Laura said, my project began by wanting to know more about Black women's activism and organization in Hartford and Connecticut more broadly. So this project that I'll be presenting today, titled "The School is the Topic at Home and Abroad," Rebecca Primus Thomas as teacher, reformer, and activist, continues the work of historians like Rosalind Terborg Penn, Kadada E. Williams, Martha Jones, historians who have rethought how we look at Black women's methods of resistance, how we analyze the tensions between race and gender, and that as a result, we can rethink women's rights history, suffrage activism, to include all of the women who were risk takers and pioneers, and at times, of course, risked their own safety and well-being in pursuit of those rights. So by taking a more intersectional approach in viewing these women by the multitude of their identities and perspectives, we can begin to reshape and reform critical histories of women's rights activism. So the life of Rebecca Primus Thomas, and even more broadly, the Primus family in Hartford, is just one facet of this broader history and story that we'll be looking at today. So Rebecca Primus Thomas, in September 1st of 1867, stood before the Talcott Street Congregational Church to give an account of her work in the South. She was a teacher at the Freedman School in Royal Oak, Maryland since 1865, and took this opportunity to speak about the biggest accomplishment of her time there, which was the imminent construction of the new schoolhouse. Her time as a teacher in Royal Oak drew on her experience as an organizer and a fundraiser in Hartford's Black community, and also spoke to her role as an advocate for her community as well. And though the defining period in her life as a teacher in the South, it was not the start or the end of her activism. We know that she was born in 1836, was the eldest of 4 children in the Primus family, and attended the first African school in Hartford. We know from her letters that she was a proficient piano player and vocalist, and that she took part in fundraising fairs and other events with her family in Hartford. This is the one of 2 photographs of Rebecca Primus Thomas. She is in the center wearing the dark hat at the age, I believe, of like 92 in this photograph. And I chose this photo to begin because it shows her with the congregation of the Talcott Street Church, the community that shaped so much of her life. The Primus family papers, which are held at the Connecticut Historical Society, consist of Rebecca's correspondence home while a teacher in Royal Oak, a variety of letters from the Primus family in Hartford, including from her brother and her mother, and then also over 150 letters from Addie Brown, who is a free working class Black woman in Hartford. And those letters reveal an intimate and intense friendship and relationship between these 2 women. I don't have the time to address that aspect today in this presentation, but it provides another really important glimpse into the experiences and activisms of Black women in Hartford and New York. So Rebecca's 60 letters really provide an opportunity for us to address silences in the historical record concerning the ambitions and work of Black teachers in the South, but also Black New Englanders in general. And it also allows us to view Rebecca not only as a teacher, but also as a daughter, a church member, a community organizer, a writer, a political thinker, and all of these other roles that she consciously occupied. And of course, these papers have not gone unnoticed in the historical record. The books featured some way or another feature the work or the life and papers of Rebecca, Addie, and the Primus family. They offer an important examination of Black middle-class life in Hartford, but they don't focus as much on her life before and after her time as a teacher in the South. So that's something that this project seeks to rectify, as well as kind of looking at Rebecca not only as a teacher, but as an activist and a suffrage reformer in this time. The Primus family were prominent and involved members of the Talcott Street Congregational Church and engaged for the fight of racial equality in historically abolitionist community. The Talcott Street Church was established in 1826, became a center of protest, debate, worship, education, and assembly for Hartford's Black community. Her mother, Mehitable Primus, was a skilled dressmaker, perhaps also a midwife, and she served on several committees and fundraising fairs for the benefit of orphans and freedmen. She was also the president of the Women's Christian Association until 1871. Holdridge Primus, who was the patriarch of the family, was a grocery store porter for over 40 years. He also served on several committees and remained active in Hartford's Black community. They owned a house on Wadsworth Street, a few streets over from Talcott Street, where the church is located, and their home became a boarding house and an employment agency for Black women, as well as Mehitable often would place or find work and place Black women into white homes as seamstresses and laborers. So the Primus family experiences speak both to the fluidity of finances and opportunities, but also to this really complex familial and kinship network that constituted this community. And I want to emphasize kind of that community aspect as well. Rebecca's decision to head south on behalf of the Hartford Freedmen's Aid Society was courageous, to say the least. Transformed by war, emancipation, and political tensions, the Reconstruction era South posed considerable risks for women, and especially Black women, going into that space as teachers and reformers. The Hartford Society, which was formed in 1865, was many organizations that collected supplies, sent teachers, sponsored material and things to be sent south during this period. They ended up sending 5 teachers to various cities in the South. And at the age of 29, Rebecca Primus was the only woman of color to be sponsored by the society. The letters that comprise this collection, Rebecca refers to as her home weeklies, reveal not only the depth of her experiences as a teacher, but also the tight-knit network of Black teachers in the South that shared successes and struggles. These letters are read by her family, members of the Hartford and Baltimore associations, and also members of the Talcott Street Church. So they had a significant impact. Apologize, my cat is joining the presentation. All right. And it's clear that Rebecca was very conscious and aware that these letters were going to be shared by and read in these different spaces. So you can see in her writing the conscious way that she frames her experiences. While in Royal Oak, she took part in weddings, church meetings, and the newly formed Union League. She also commented on the tensions, racial tensions, political tensions that she observed, as well as the self-determination of a Black community willing to forge their own path into freedom and political rights. Unfortunately, she did not escape suspicion from the white community in Maryland as well. In 1866, she had an unfortunate encounter with the postmaster of the town of Royal Oak, who had gone through her mail, opened it, and then held it hostage, demanding that she pay additional fees. Not only was this a direct violation of her privacy, but it harkened back to an obsolete law in Maryland meant to prevent abolitionist papers from reaching the hands of enslaved people. This was a tense moment of encounter that resulted in Rebecca directing her mail elsewhere to the town of Easton. And she kind of minimizes the incident in her accounts to her family, kind of saying, oh, you know, I've taken care of it. We've resolved this issue. But it nonetheless speaks to the fact that these conflicts were probably likely a common occurrence in her life. We know from letters from Addie Brown that the windows of her schoolhouse were broken on a couple occasions. So we know that there was kind of a direct attack onto this effort of education and racial uplift as well. As a teacher, she also wrestled with the disorganization of both the Hartford Society and the Baltimore Association. Unfortunately, the unreliable distribution of her salary left her in a state of constant financial uncertainty. She was undoubtedly aware that she was paid $30 a month as compared to the $50 a month paid to white teachers from the same society in the same state. She also encountered what she describes as like the tone deafness of the association leaders who failed to recognize the needs and preferences of the freed communities in Maryland. By prioritizing white teachers, the Hartford Society and the Baltimore associations also undervalued the contributions of Black volunteers. And again, you know, failed to recognize the preferences of the people that they were supposedly helping. So although partially funded by the Freedmen's Bureau and these associations, the school in Royal Oak was mostly subsidized by the local Black community. Charles H. Thomas, the man with whom and his family that she boarded with in Maryland, was a member of the board of the school, and they were very involved in different activities and events that she put on. Monthly reports like the one that's visible here from October of 1868 detail the events and different things that were going on in her school. They also talk about student demographics and you know, reasons that students could not or did not come to school, including sickness, illness, and more predominantly labor responsibilities. So Rebecca closely monitored annual reports, other documentation from places like the Freedmen's Bureau for risk reliance on school supplies and funding, and also held school exhibitions to demonstrate the labor and success of her school. And of course, Royal Oak's commitment to establishing a school accompanied a broader effort of protest and activism within the Black community of Maryland. The construction of the schoolhouse in particular served as a permanent commitment to collective uplift, a project in which teachers' labor was overtly political, and that's important to emphasize. The process of purchasing land, material, and supplies for the school that would eventually become known as the Primus Institute was a lofty endeavor that required lots of work on behalf of Rebecca. While she solicited funds from members of the Maryland community, both adults and students, her mother Mehitable and the women of the Talcott Street Church held a Freedmen's Fair to raise money to build the schoolhouse at the same time in Hartford. So a 4-day affair featuring delicacies, music, dancing. The Hartford Freedmen's Fair raised about $200 for the construction of the schoolhouse, which is a significant amount. It was eventually built in late 1867 and would serve as a school for Black children until 1929. So the construction of this schoolhouse really solidified this educational institution as pivotal to racial uplift in Royal Oak. Historian Barbara Beeching, who wrote a book on the Primus family in Hartford, was featured earlier in this presentation, says overtly in her book that Rebecca Primus was not interested in women's suffrage, that it lay outside the realm of her interest. But it would be wrong, I believe, to conclude that only that her interest in Black men's suffrage and the right to vote excluded her support of that for Black women. So we see through her letters and writing that she remained deeply aware of the vulnerable position that she and other Black women occupied, both as laborers and citizens. She was exposed to various forms of violence while in Royal Oak, and she often also takes the time to note instances where Black women protested this violence and discrimination, particularly other Black teachers who spoke out against things like being shoved off sidewalks or being removed from waiting rooms in the train depots. So by in her defiance in the face of this discrimination, but also demand for respect for herself and her person really speaks to her advocacy for these issues. And we can also see that through what she's reading. So we know that she was reading the Anti-Slavery Standard, the Independent. She mentions reading prominent abolitionists and suffragists Lydia Maria Child and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And most importantly, we see that she's reading Frances Harper, who was a really prominent temperance activist, suffragist, abolitionist speaker, poet, writer, to name maybe a few of the things that she did. Frances Harper was also traveling in the South while Rebecca was setting up her school in Royal Oak. So we really have this helpful parallel between these two women that speaks to not only Rebecca Primus's familiarity with these concepts, but her advocacy for them. A unique lens into her life in Royal Oak, the Primus family papers don't really go beyond to tell us much about her life when she returns to Hartford. We know that she returned in 1869 to Hartford. She likely continued teaching at the Sabbath school at the Talcott Street Church. She also did seamstress work and household labor and was a dressmaker with her mother. She sought out additional work. She appears as an agent selling a self-help book in 1870. And then Charles Thomas, who she boards with, and his family in Royal Oak, moves to Hartford in 1870, and they end up getting married in 1873. You see their marriage notice on the right. This is the only other photograph that exists of Rebecca Primus Thomas from around 1900 with members of her family. Again, very, very few kind of images of her. So you see her kind of sitting kind of resolutely in the back of the crowd. Unfortunately, her husband, Charles Thomas, suffered a near fatal injury in 1873. All we know of the incident is that a white man named Thomas Quinn struck him on the head with a sharp stone, and that this incident left him permanently disabled. So Rebecca Primus Thomas most likely became the main breadwinner and the caretaker of her husband as a result of this event. And although Charles went on to work as a gardener and for a brief time the doorkeeper of the state senate in Connecticut, they spent the majority of their marriage kind of struggling for to support themselves in this period in Hartford, doing this kind of piecemeal work. And they had a son who sadly also passed away at 7 months. We can also kind of imagine her involvement in activist circles through the records that exist of her husband, her father, and her brother-in-law, William B. Edwards. So all three of these men appear in voting records for the town, state, and presidential elections as early as they possibly could, for Holdridge as early as 1870. They all have really interesting and unique histories of their own, which I don't have time to address today. But these three men are so actively involved in different organizations and groups. They appear petitioning the city for improvements like putting in sidewalks outside of their homes. They appear, again, as I said, in voting records. William B. Edwards is a member of the Booker T. Washington Club, the Union League. Holdridge is the treasurer of the Talcott Street Church. They are kind of intimately involved in their community in these activist circles in Hartford. And of course, as a woman, Rebecca Primus Thomas would not have been allowed to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But voter registration records demonstrate that she registered to vote as early as 1905. The significance of these voter registration cards, I feel I cannot overstate how important they are. There are very few records of, who voted and when, and, whether or not Rebecca voted. May be unclear, but I can kind of imagine that, despite the barriers and challenges, intimidation, all these restrictions that faced women of color's access to voting rights, she went to the registrar's office and demanded that she register to vote for that opportunity and for that right. So 15 years before women were deemed eligible voters, Rebecca Primus Thomas had a voter registration card, and that really speaks to Black women's bold pursuit of the vote in this period. And suffrage, women's rights more broadly. And her sister as well registered to vote at the same time. So the existence of these two cards also speaks to, we can imagine, a broader community of Black women who are going together and seeking out these rights. Rebecca Primus Thomas died at the age of 95 in 1932 and was buried in an unmarked grave of the Zion Hill Cemetery in Hartford, Connecticut. She spent her final months battling an illness in a municipal hospital and was buried in a funeral officiated by Reverend James A. Wright within the Talcott Street Church, this community that shaped so much of her life. Her obituary merely refers to her as the widow of Charles Thomas and doesn't really say anything about her time as a teacher or accomplishments in her life. Although it was a struggle to locate these graves, it's kind of easy to imagine her being placed, being laid to rest within this Primus family plot next to her sister and her parents. There are a few physical reminders of her life, as this unmarked grave demonstrates, but she leaves behind a legacy of courage and strength in the face of discrimination and restriction. She was a teacher, reformer, church mother, and activist, and she occupied a vital position in Hartford's Black community. So although obscured by incomplete records, gaps, and many unanswered questions, her life nonetheless illustrates the continued battle for civil rights, suffrage, and equality. So examining her story beyond just her role as a teacher in the Reconstruction South not only offers an incredible glimpse into the labor and reform of Hartford's Black community, and of course how that community linked to other communities in Maryland, Philadelphia, New York, Hartford, Boston, where Rebecca traveled throughout her life, but also allows us to critically reframe these abolitionist histories. Thank you, everybody, so much. I will pass it over to Professor Brittany Yancey.
I was searching for the hand clap button on here. Just amazing work, Katie. This is just, I have all types of thoughts and questions, and your project is incredible. Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Brittany Yancey, just Brittany. I'd like to invite my project team to join me. Tonight, we have a presentation to share with you on our project that has been in the works for about 2 years. Excuse me there. So we are going to share with you some of the amazing information that we have come across in our work. Excuse me, if I get myself set up here. Tonight, I am joined by an amazing team that has made this possible. And I will allow each of them to just quickly introduce themselves and say something to the crowd here. Eileen, we'll start with you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Eileen Frank. I'm the Chief Curator at the Connecticut Historical Society. It's a real pleasure to speak with you tonight and share this amazing research that we've been working on for a number of years, and which was recently funded. The new part was funded by the League of Women Voters, and we really thank them for that funding. And I will pass it on to Karen.
Hello, good evening. My name is Karen Lai Miller, and I am the research historian at the Connecticut Historical Society. And I'm delighted to work with you and talk with you tonight. I'll pass it over to Chelsea.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Chelsea Echevarria. I have a master's degree in public history from Central Connecticut State University and a bachelor's in history from Mount Holyoke College. And I am also delighted to be here. And I will pass it over to Kiana.
Hi, I'm Kiana Calafieri. I'm one of the research assistants, and I got a bachelor's degree in public history and women's and gender studies. And I'm also really thrilled to be here. And I guess I'll pass it back to Brittany.
Thank you. It takes a team to be able to delve into this type of work, and we have been working at this, as Eileen stated. This project started about 2.5 years ago, and I don't think any of us thought that we would be here and have just been able to uncover the amazing women that for too long have been on the margins of our state's history. And so we are very excited to share with you some of the work that we have been doing. We are going to go through this project. Eileen is going to kick us off and kind of contextualize the project and give you some background on how this all came together and where we got our title from. Karen and I are going to walk you through the project and just provide some historical context about the project. And then each of us are going to profile some of the women that we have been delving into. And then we'll wrap up. And so we will hopefully you will have some questions, but this project is a digital archive community project, and that is one of the things that I'll talk about at the end, about the way in which community has been at the center of this, and we've been able to pull this together. So I'm going to toss it over to Eileen, but before I do that, I just want to reiterate, this project had 3 phases. In the first phase, we, thought we had an idea, right? And the CT Humanities was able to support us with the grant to kick off this project. And so the phase 2 of the project is really where the League of Women Voters has just been incredible to support us and have been able to allow us to really expand this project in various ways that we'll talk about tonight. And so we are so excited and thankful for the work that we've been able to do. I will kick it over to Eileen.
Thank you. So as Brittany said, this was started a few years ago when the state and the nation was preparing to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage, the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And as we were gearing up for that commemoration, the names Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, other names of famous suffragists were being talked about a lot, and people know those names from their history classes and from their own studies. But the names that weren't known as much were names like Mary Townsend Seymour. And so we wanted to make sure that the women of color who were just as involved in the fight for women's suffrage got attention, got the research that they deserved, and got the public awareness that they also deserved. So I mentioned Mary Townsend Seymour, and that's because she is the woman who kicked this project off for us. She was the one who was most familiar to us at the beginning. She is the co-founder of the Hartford chapter of the NAACP, which was founded in 1917. She also ran for state office in 1920, was not elected, but she did run for state office. And she has a very long history of civic activism and civic engagement. She, in a letter to Mary Ovington, who's another famous suffragist and who is the one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, she writes in this letter in 1919, the work must be done. And she's talking about that as we are pushing forward for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, it should be as comprehensive as possible. Don't leave anyone out. Don't let racism come into play and deny African-American women and other women of color the right to vote. And she's really making this plea. And this letter, what's exciting is that this letter is held in the Watkinson Library at Trinity College. It is, it's here in the state of Connecticut. And when we rediscovered this letter, we also found the name of our project, The Work Must Be Done, which we have taken as also our challenge, our charge, that we need to do this work to do some real basic history, mystery research, look in those newspaper articles, look in church records and archives, look in bulletins to find women who were engaged in civic life and in church life and very active in their community, and then to find examples of how we see that they supported the right for suffrage, whether it's through those voter registration cards. I'm so glad that those were mentioned. They're such a valuable resource, whether it's through newspaper clippings that talk about the fact that they were at an event around suffrage. We had to find these glimpses of their complete life to raise them up. And what we feel is to restore the title suffragist to these women who are actively, in a lot of ways, were actively denied that title. So that's the background of this project. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to talk about what new research they were able to uncover with this funding and as Brittany said, raise up some of these women.
Thank you, Eileen. So this phase of the project, we felt we were making 3 contributions. As Eileen stated, in 2020, the centennial year really allowed us to revisit this 72-year history that we call the suffrage movement. And really think about and ask more critical questions about where are the women of color who contributed to the movement. A lot of scholars, as Katie stated, one being Martha Jones, who has been very supportive of the work of this project. We were very thrilled to share with her the project going forward when she came to the Historical Society last year. That this particular project is looking to really accomplish 3 objectives here. We said that we would reframe the history of voting rights in Connecticut, realizing that for women of color, the term suffrage was not one that was always being able to access, nor did they define themselves as suffragists, but they did contribute to advancing the voting rights struggle that went before 1848 and beyond 1920. We also thought, because of that this project would look at the lives of women and it would help us rethink what we mean by the term suffrage, by the term citizenship and democracy. And I think the lives that we have been able to come across and the stories that we'll be able to tell help us think a little deeper about what these terms mean. And then the last kind of goal of the project really is to reimagine the intersection of voting rights, the state of Connecticut, and public history, and how this particular project, as Eileen said, is one that brings the community together, one that we cannot just go to the state archives to uncover, that we have gone all across the state. We have gone to churches, we have gone I have even had someone give me something they found in their basement. And so recognizing that there's a public facing side of this project that is critical to be able to really recast what we mean by we say the voting rights struggle here in Connecticut and who was a contributor of it. So Karen and I are going to kind of talk through organizations and sites of where these women kind of, particularly here in Connecticut, how they organize, right? This particular project, while we are very familiar with the 1848 timeline to 1920, that 72-year history, our project and the work and more broadly in looking at women of color, particularly African American women and Indigenous women, really challenges that 72-year history and helps us think about the generations of women who came before 1848 and those who had to march on beyond 1920. And what I'd like to just say here in terms of the state of Connecticut is that in 1818, Connecticut revises its state constitution, and they define who is able to become an elector in that constitution. It is that constitution, the version of that constitution, that really springs a generation of activists, and particularly predominantly African American activists, someone who that you may be familiar with. The family that she belongs to is the Beeman family, the real famous African American abolitionist family. You're familiar with the sons, Amos Beeman, who is a religious leader in Connecticut, in New Haven. His brother, Leverett, lived in Middletown, and his wife, Clarissa. They live in the historic district that is still intact today, that is in the southwest corner of Wesleyan's campus. And their daughter is part of our project, Clara Burr. And so, you know, this is, again, when we think about generations of women who are activists and on the ground, another group of women that oftentimes gets overlooked when we talk about suffrage are Indigenous women. That is probably an area that needs more exploration. We have great scholars here in Connecticut. I'll just shout him out, Chris Newell, who is a wonderful Indigenous scholar who wrote a great piece in the CT Explored last summer that talks about as early as the 18th century that you had Indigenous women petitioning the General Assembly for the protection of their land on settler encroachment. You have women who are the head of the Mohegan tribe early on, right? All of this is happening, all this type of political power is happening way before 1848. And so how do we make sure that when we're talking about the activity that is happening in our state, right, that we're making sure that we're broadening the timeline to make sure that we include the early generations going forward. For our particular project, we stick with the generation that emerges in the 1890s and goes through the 1840s. That particular generation, we know as we are approaching the turn of the 20th century, that we have a reform movement that is on the ground. And women across all backgrounds, young generation, they are on the ground. They are interested in reforming America. And African American women and other women of color are right there. And we know most of the women that are part of our project fall within this generation. And so we look forward to sharing with you some of them this evening. One of the things that we came across very quickly is that these women, that we had to search for them. And so I'm going to toss it over to Karen to talk about the impact and the role of the church in particular as it relates to sites of where we understood some of these women were organizing. Oops, I'm sorry.
Thank you. So
Whoops. You know what? I'm so sorry about this.
it's okay.
I'm so sorry about this. Do you want to talk about the organizations?
I'll just toss it back to you. Sorry, do you want to do the organizations first?
Sure. I'm sorry about this. It looks like something was out of place. One of the things is that we had several organizations that we were able to uncover in talking about some of the women in this project. We know that, again, by the turn of the 20th century, we have all types of organizations that are nationally on the ground and regionally and locally. And the ones that are listed here are organizations that have been brought in or developed or formed by women of color in the state of Connecticut. And so we kind of organized this particular slide to demonstrate the breadth and the reach in which these women had, bringing in national organizations into the state through their work. One of the things that I want to just share with you, the first organization that is on here, the National Association of Colored Women Clubs, is probably one of the most undersung organizations of this time period. This particular organization represents, for example, a group of women of color who felt that they were excluded from the mainstream suffrage movement and felt that they could develop their own movement to address the needs in their communities. Again, when we're talking about women of color and we're talking about the 1890s, we're talking about the height of the Jim Crow era. For most African American women in particular, the agenda cannot just be suffrage. And they felt that the voting rights would allow them to address the multiple issues that they are facing in their communities. And so we're talking about lynching, we're talking about unemployment, education, violence, all of these issues, they felt having the right to vote would help them address those issues. And the National Association for Colored Women Clubs, by its founding in 1896, is the largest Black organization in America at the time, political organization in America at the time. This predates the founding of the NAACP, the National Urban League, and some of the other organizations that we're more familiar with. But at 1896, the NACW has almost 5,000 members, and they're organized in regional and state federations. One of the things that I want to share with you when we talk about the power of having the relationship with the community in this project, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this, but if you can see this small purple book here, this is the actual convention minutes from the 1896 founding convention of the National Association for Colored Women Clubs. Why do I have a copy of this, right? This was actually found in the basement of one of my elder sorority sisters in the North End of Hartford. She told me one day, she's like, hey, you wanna come by my house? I think I have some books you'll probably like to read. And I'm like, what are you doing with this? This is like a gold mine for a historian, you know? This is just randomly in her basement. And that just speaks to the fact that I am sure that if all of us on this Zoom call reached out to one person in our community, that we'd probably find a gem in their basement, guaranteed. But in this book, as I'm reading what they were doing in 1896 in Washington, D.C. at the 19th Street Baptist Church, was the famous African-American church in D.C., their keynote speaker is Harriet Tubman. Can you imagine going to a convention and your keynote speaker is Harriet Tubman? And it's all who's who that is at this convention forming this organization. It's Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper. In terms of African-American community, these are the top women of the day. And Harriet Tubman ends her remarks on the third day of the convention by holding up Ida B. Wells' infant son who was there with her and declaring him the baby of the Federation. And so, so again, this particular organization is critical to our project. Connecticut belongs to the Northeastern Federation, and it is the largest federation in the country. It is established by a woman named Mary Dickerson, who was actually born in Haddam, Connecticut, but moves to Providence and becomes one of the leading women in the nation, honestly, along with some of the national figures. But in 1897, she works to establish Connecticut's first Black women's club that is in Norwich in 1897, called the Rose of New England League. And Chelsea will talk about that when she gives her remarks. And so from 1897 onward, you have a series of clubs that start to pop up across the state. And this becomes a huge organizing site for African-American women. One of those clubs is behind me. To give you an example, this is the New Haven Women's 20th Century Club that was established in 1901. And the women that we have here on this photo, we actually do have most of their names, which is something that you typically don't have when we're talking about women in general and women of color specifically. And the New Haven Museum has just been such a wonderful partner in this project. And when they identified, they said, hey, we think we have something that you'll probably enjoy. They were spot on. And this just gives you an example of the types of women. You can see here that you have a group of women who are in New Haven on the ground, addressing all types of reform issues and organizing under the Northeastern Federation. I'm going to toss it over to Karen so she can talk about some of the sites that we've been able to come across in terms of where these women are organizing and how critical it is, right, that this is the community project as these women use the community to be able to do their work.
Churches have long been sites of religious gathering, social gathering, and political gathering in communities of color. Brittany aptly titles this section of praise and politics. And as Brittany was talking about the importance of clubs and other organizations, we are reminded that most of these women were also involved in church communities as well. These are safe places to gather, places which nurture their, political interest, nurture their sense of identity and social self. And also, we've all found churches like in Norwich that independent, like in of themselves, have been political from their own founding as well. I'm actually going to return it back to Brittany if you want to talk about some of the specific churches we've worked with. And also, Brittany will tell you again, these are in the basements. We're actually convinced that the basements and attics of organizations, people's homes, and churches hold great treasures.
Great treasures. We had, just to give you an example, we were able to go into the Union Baptist Church on Main Street in Hartford. And when I arrived there, they said, oh, we're going to take you to our archives. And it was in the basement, in a storage closet, which is great, right? I'm familiar with this as a resource. And it was perfect. And it was exactly what I was looking for, going through church anniversary programs and church directories and things of that nature. This is actually a Hartford Current front page photo. And just to give you an example of what Karen was talking about, this particular photo is in the sanctuary of Shiloh Baptist Church, which was the church on the previous slide. Shiloh, there seems to be a particular interest of Shiloh, and it definitely, Shiloh is actually one of the sites that I really want to learn more about what its role was at the turn of the 20th century, because it seems that a lot of people and a lot of organizations met at Shiloh Baptist Church again, talking about politics and praise. This is a Northeastern Federation convention that is taking place in 1918. The theme of the convention is votes for women. And so when we talk about particularly women of color being involved in the suffrage movement, you can see there, I don't know what topic is on the floor, but they look pretty serious. And I was just praying that the current could find a more clearer picture. But this is what we have. But this gives you a example of how you can see African American women in particular coming together, organizing in their own community, in their own community institutions. Another organization that is a critically important organization. A lot of times when we talk about the club movement, it has a certain type of class critique to it, as most women associate themselves with upper to middle class communities and represent that. The National Association for Wage Earners is actually one that is looking to work with working Black women in particular. And Minnie Bradley is from New Haven, but the founders of this organization she joins, who are the towering figures in the African American community at the moment, Mary McLeod Bethune and Nanny Helen Burroughs. These two women are ranking right up there with Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and others. And Bradley joins them in establishing this organization that is interested in organizing Black working women, ensuring that they have access to the ballot box, knowing the rights, making sure that they have labor rights. And they are a labor union organization at the core. And so you can see here some of the officers that she is working with. As I said, Burroughs, Bethune, Chelsea may talk about Mary Talbert, who is leading. She's a co-founder of the NAACP, but currently she's a NACW president, and she goes on to establish the Anti-Lynching Crusaders. And so this just gives you an idea of how Connecticut women are not only making local impact, but they have national impact and implications. Now, each of us are going to kind of just go through and profile just some of the women who we have come across. I'm going to start, then Karen will follow, and then Chelsea and Kiana will wrap us up. I'm actually going to kick it off here. Emma Felding Baker is someone who people may be familiar with. She is an Indigenous woman from the Mohegan Pequot tribe. Her core goals and objectives in her community is to maintain and preserve the historical records and traditions. At the turn of the 20th century, she is elected by the tribe to testify in front of the General Assembly regarding land disputes, particularly over the burial grounds. And so her role is critical. And it's, again, when we talk about how women of color are organizing and galvanizing and harnessing their political power, we have this happening in various capacities. And she certainly makes a huge inroad and contribution in that era. Another woman who we, particularly in this kind of second phase of the project, that is making a huge impact both on a state and a national level is Rebecca Tanner, and she is from Stanford. She is a businesswoman. She owns an African-American arts and crafts shop in Stanford. We can't really, there's not a lot of documentation on her. And Stanford was actually one of the organization's sites actually that we, it was kind of difficult finding locations and particularly working with the local history historian. to really understand the more full kind of scope of how African-American women were organizing in Stanford. But we were able to come across some newspaper um, 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 examples and articles that were able to tell us that Stanford was an organizing site, particularly in the Club Women's movement, and she was critical to that. Another organization that had a large presence in Connecticut was the National League of Colored Republican Women that actually is established after the 19th Amendment is passed. The Republican Party, as people may know, in the aftermath of the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, as African Americans are gaining access to the ballot box, particularly African American men, politically, a lot of African Americans align with the Republican Party. You see this shift that takes place in the mid-30s, but really from the 1870s onward up into the 1920s, you have African Americans that are overwhelmingly Republican, and the Colored Republican Women's League is a league that was very much on the ground here in Connecticut, and Rebecca Tanner was president of that league. Someone else who was kind of her right-hand person is Elizabeth Jeter Green, who was more of an activist organizer. She too was a member of the league. In fact, when we started researching this, you can actually pull this particular document up on the website. When we researched this particular organization, this organization, again, was also founded by Nanny Burroughs, and she is interested in how African-American women are organizing and what they thought about politics. And so they issued these questionnaires, and with the gracious financial assistance from the League of Women Voters, I was able to go to the Library of Congress manuscript room and actually look at these original documents. And these questionnaires are fascinating. And this particular one is Elizabeth Jeter Green. This is actually online too. Her particular one is actually online, this first page of it. And it just gives you, I don't know if you can see some of the text here, but the first question asked her that in 1920, how many Negro women participated in the election? And she says 200. And so, you know, when I'm reading this, I'm like, 200 African-American women participating in 1920 in the presidential election. I mean, that's huge. And so this organization and their resources was an incredible find. And Jeter Green is just someone who, as you can see here, she's very much committed to equal rights. She belongs to several organizations, including your own. It is said in her obituary that she was the founder of the New London League of Women Voters. Now, Carol and I believe Carol Reamer is on here. We are going to find out these African-American women who we have come across that are aligned with the League of Women Voters. We believe that they are part of colored sections of the League of Women Voters that are also being established. And so, you know, we're trying to find this out. And one day, Carol, we're going to come across the document that confirms this. But you can see here, Jeter Green belongs to several organizations. She's also a businesswoman along with Rebecca Tanner, and they both belong to the National Negro Business League. So that just gives you an idea of some of the women who I have come across, and I'm going to toss this over to Karen.
I'd like to introduce you to the Edwards sisters. We love to show this map of the Edwards sisters. They are three women who moved from Americus, Georgia to Hartford about 1917. So all three sisters moved individually with their families. And we love this because it shows that despite that transition, families were able to maintain very close contact. And I'm sure that this was a very politically active neighborhood, considering that these three women were leading activism in just within a few blocks. So on the far, whoops.
Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so just on the far left is the oldest sister, Lena Knighton. On the far right is the middle sister, Benny Glover, and in the middle is the youngest sister, Anna B. Reese. The next slide. So we know the least about Anna B. Reese, but she is the youngest of the three political Edward sisters. We know that all three of them fought for not only women's voting rights, but also highly encouraged African Americans to become politically active. We know that Anna and her sisters were all involved with the Colored Voters League, as well as the Colored Women's Republican Clubs. Minnie Glover is the middle sister, and she's probably the most well-known. She was highly active in Republican politics for decades. One of, I think, most notable achievements that Minnie was able to encourage Black women to become registered voters. So in 1936, the Women's Republican Club of Hartford reported that they had an increase of 81% of Black women voters. And that was due in large part to Minnie Glover's campaigning and encouraging other Black women to become, to claim and exercise their electoral voices. And the oldest sister is Lena Knighton. She outlived all of her siblings to be the blessed age of 100. She was also active in the Republican Party until Franklin D. Roosevelt came to office, and then she switched to the Democratic Party. And this caused some friendly, sisterly rivalry. But one notable thing about Lena is that she is among that first generation, of laying the groundwork for future generations of Black politics. When Boyce Barlow was elected, Boyce Barlow is the first Black judge in Connecticut. Boyce Barlow is also the first Black person to be elected to the Connecticut State Senate. And he, honored Lena Knighton at her 100th birthday and said, Lena Knighton was even an old timer back when, he started to come a rise on the political scene, and, attributed his success to, people who were groundbreakers and trailblazers like Lena and her sisters.
Hey, Chelsea?
So we're gonna switch all the way to Norwich, where, like Brittany said, it was the site of the first Connecticut branch of the Northeastern Federation of Women's Clubs, along with the Rose of New England League. Now, I'm also going to talk a little bit about praise in politics, which is sort of embodied in the two women that I'm going to talk about, which are two sisters, Annie Drury and Idella Scott. Now, Annie Drury, we're going to start with her first. She was involved in the Rose of New England League, but not unlike her sister Idella. She did not hold a leadership position within that organization. She was more active in the anti-lynching crusaders in 1922 when the local Norwich branch was established. Now, she was the one-time local director of the society, and there's the little clip from the Norwich Bulletin that's there. So one thing I found out with all of the Norwich women, there were very few, but there were actually no photographs of any of the women that I researched. I wasn't able to find any when I went to the Norwich Library, to the Otis Library in Norwich, or in the many issues of the Norwich Bulletin that I went through. But Annie was, I think she was the elder of the two sisters. No, she was the younger of the two sisters. And she and her sister were both born in Jewett City to Moses Scott. I got her confused with Clara. With Moses Scott and his wife. They both held various jobs as either seamstresses, dressmakers, or domestic servants throughout their lives. Idella never married, but Annie did. Annie married a Theodore Drury, who we know absolutely nothing about. She had a daughter who died in infancy. And by 1920, she was widowed and living with Idella. Now, Annie was very active in her church. She was very active in the Mount Calvary Baptist Church, and she was the church's clerk. And she was actually a delegate to the New England Baptist Missionary Convention for about 2 years in a row. And in 1922, when the Norwich branch of the Anti-Lynching Crusaders was organized, Annie became the local director. Now, anti-lynching crusaders, they backed the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which would have made lynching, I believe it would have made lynching a federal hate crime. The bill did not end up passing through Congress, which is unfortunate. And she also was active in numerous other local organizations, including, like we said, in the church. Now, she died in 1940. She outlived her sister Idella. She actually outlived the entirety of her family. Her obituary says that she was the last member of her immediate family. It never talked about her. They didn't talk about her activism with the anti-lynching crusaders. It only seemed to mention her church activity, which is sort of par for the course when you're talking about women who were not married and didn't have kids. And then I think we can move to Idella. No, there we go. So Idella was a little bit more active in the political side of things than her sister Annie, but when I think of the kind of the connection between praise and politics, I feel like Idella embodies that very much so in just her and her life and what I know of her life, because she was active not only with the Rose of New England Women's League, but she was also active in both Mount Calvary Baptist Church as well as the Evans Memorial AME Zion Church. So she was the president of the New England Women's League for some years. Now, the Rose of New England Women's League was organized in 1897. A lot of the women that we researched were presidents of the organization, like Clara Burr. She was a longtime president of the organization. Now, Clara Burr is the daughter of Leverett Beeman and his wife, and she was born in Middletown. She had that legacy of activism that did inform her club work. And then we have Idella, who took over for I believe it was a Jenny King as a president. Now, Idella wasn't just active in the Rose of New England Women's League. They advocated for the education and welfare of Black women and children in Norwich. She was also active with the Union Lyceum. The Union Lyceum is definitely an organization that deserves more research and a little bit more scrutiny. They seem to be a religious organization, judging by the newspaper articles that talks about how they hosted Bible readings, religious concerts, stuff like that. But then they were also kind of an intellectual knowledge sharing organization, because they had things like a mock trial article. Like, there was an article that they hosted a mock trial. They would host discussions. They would host lectures. And in one of those lectures in 1914, Idella co-wrote a speech with someone, I think her name is Cassie Robinson, who's another woman who deserves more research, because she's mentioned in a lot of activism and a lot of the articles that talk about the Rose of New England Women's League, as well as the Union Lyceum. She co-wrote this paper that she delivered to a population at Grace Memorial. And she has that quote where the movement for women's suffrage is just a part of the eternal forward march of the human race towards a complete revolution. We don't have, or I wasn't able to find any voter registration cards in Norwich. If we did, that would have been fantastic. But a lot of the research was kind of stymied just by the lack of sources available. I relied on Norwich Bulletin articles, as well as talking to, just conversations that I was having with the staff at the Otis Library. And that's something that could stand further. It could be something that there's a lot of avenues in Norwich for further research, especially when we're talking about women like Idella and Clara. And one of the things that stood out to me during this whole entire research experience is when we were having that discussion, I believe it was either Karen or Eileen who said, she's somewhere. she's got to be somewhere. And I think that was kind of my main takeaway from research, was kind of to just persevere and get creative, because they're going to be somewhere. And Idella died in 1934. She never married, and she was actually mentioned in her obituary as someone who had many friends and was very active, again, in her church community. And that was kind of the trend for a lot of the obituaries. They tended to shy away from a lot of the Norwich women's political activities in favor of talking about their church activities, because that was something that was such a huge part of their lives, as well as something that also bolstered their political activities. The only exception to that was Clara Burr's obituary, which I thought was pretty interesting because it talks a lot about her political activities. But it also kind of her status as a wife and mother was sort of the first thing that took priority, which says a lot about how our society and our culture chooses to remember women. And with that, I will turn it over to Kiana, who's going to talk about Gladys Bailey.
All right, I'm going to take you a little bit down the timeline and down to Bridgeport to highlight Gladys Bailey. From our research, we found that most of the activism for women's rights in Bridgeport really shined post-World War II, but still the progress of the 1920s women paved the way for future generations to continue and evolve the work. I had the opportunity to research at the Bridgeport Public Library, where they have many sources, both digital and physical, in their archives. And it led me to great discoveries about Gladys and about other Bridgeport activists. So a bit of background about Gladys. She was born in 1915 in Virginia. Her family moved north when she was an infant, and she stayed in the Northeast since then. While doing my research, I came across her oral history, which is a great resource for any historian to find because it's in her own words. It was conducted by the Afro-American Educators Association in the 1980s to study the changes in Bridgeport neighborhoods from the viewpoint of selected Black residents. And in the interview, she describes that as a young woman, she had struggles finding work as a nurse because places wouldn't hire her, and some would rather go on strike than put her even on their staff. But she eventually found work in Harlem and continued her education, and eventually ended up in Bridgeport in 1949, where she worked for 8 years at the Department of Public Health, right before her long-term career as a nurse at Central High School. Being a high school nurse didn't stop her from participating in her community activities. We were able to discover some of her activities from local newspapers, yearbooks, and online databases. In the 1960s, she became the president of the Lettres Business and Professional Women's Club, which is a Black women's civic organization, and the president of the Greater Bridgeport Council of Negro Women. And even in 1967, she received the Sojourner Truth Award from the National Association of Negro Business and Professional Women's Club, who highlighted her work as a school nurse, teacher, and as the advisor of the Future Nurses and Health Career Club, which we could see from this picture of the club with Gladys on the bottom right. But this is just the tip of the iceberg of all the work that Gladys did in her lifetime, because she was part of many other organizations as listed on the slide, and was even a very active member of the Messiah Baptist Church in Bridgeport. And I think many people may underestimate the efforts of nurses in civic engagement, because many civic nurses provide healthcare while also advocating for change in their communities. This is why it is important to do research locally with libraries and specific organizations to form a narrative into women who were not activists, but had local careers. It would definitely be worth it to dig deeper into the organization's records. Going back to the research at the Bridgeport Public Library, some examples of their records include their local League of Women Voters documents, the Lettres Incorporated documents, and also the YWCA's Phyllis Wheatley branch, which also explains how a lot of colored women in the town would gather to be activists and vote. All influential organizations for Bridgeport and other parts of Connecticut. We were even able to uncover more names of women of color in Bridgeport, which is a very nice discovery because before this research, we didn't know much about Bridgeport women, and now we have a path of resources to possibly uncover a lot more narratives. Taking a quote from her oral history, she gives advice for future generations with this quote where she says, talk it out, act it out, and do what we are supposed to do, because we could do it if we just get together and do it. It's so easy to do the right thing. So easy. It's so hard to do the wrong thing. Now, Gladys died in 1999 in Monroe, Connecticut, but a good takeaway from Gladys was that she believes strongly in education, volunteering, and discussions, which is something that I really love about this project because it is continuing conversation and recognizes those women who made such a great difference in their communities.
Awesome. Thank you, Chelsea and Kiana. One of the things I love the fact that Kiana talked about the legacy of nurses. The last person who I just wanted to highlight, she is actually an anti-suffragist. She's a Mohawk Indian that moved to New Haven and married an African-American man. And so culturally, she identified with the African-American community. Laura Bell Reed McCoy is someone who, again, is part of this generation that's at the turn of the 20th century. She is in the juvenile justice community. She works with children. She works at what is known as the Q House, the Dixwell Community House, some of you may be familiar with. In 1925, though, again, talking about some of the records that we come across, even though she was an anti-suffragist, this is interesting. She was a member of the League of Women Voters and even participated with some of the other African-American women who are part of our project who were also members as an officer in the 19th Board League of Women Voters. And so this was something that it's interesting, again, a question mark that we're going to figure out where is this and how is it reflected and archived in the League of Women Voters documents. In 1928, she establishes Girl Scouts, the first Girl Scout troop in the country for African-American girls. And one of her prize members was Justice Constance Baker Motley, was actually one of her favorite troop members that came through Troop 24. In 1940, even though she did not believe in suffrage, and you can see a quote here, and she felt that it was a man's job, voting at the time was for men. Very interesting. And if anyone is interested in actually reading her entire oral history, UConn has it, and I believe the library has it. The Historical Society perhaps may have a copy of it, but it's a full oral history with McCoy, and she talks about what she thought about suffrage at the time. However, her activism in politics encouraged her to run on the Democratic ticket in 1939 for the Board of Aldermen in New Haven, and she won and served for 3 years and lived out a life in politics for the rest of her life. And she advocated for children, she advocated for the elderly, and it was a way in which she committed to community for the rest of her life. But it's interesting that she did not identify as a suffragist. And so those are just some of the women. Again, each of you, I believe the League will share our full report that we submitted for, that we will be submitting on behalf of this project. And each of you will have access to it where you can see more of the women who were part of this report. 2 years ago, this organization invited me to give a talk for your centennial convention. And some of you who may have been at that convention may remember this slide. This is actually your plaque that hangs in the state capitol. In January of 2020, right before we started this project, West Hartford historian Dr. Tracy Wilson showed this image. We were on a panel together, and she said, and some of you may have been in the audience at that presentation at the University of St. Joe's, and she challenged the Connecticut League of Women Voters that this plaque honors the women in the suffrage movement from 1848 to 1920. And all of the women on this plaque are white women. And so she challenged, she said, because of the great research that's going on, that, you know, this project in particular is going to uncover a cadre of women. And we were so excited. It was the perfect timing. And I know since then she had challenged the league to redo the plaque. And I know that you all have a new plaque that is up, that is based in some of the women who are part of this project are on that plaque. And so I just wanted to show you that this is some of the women, most of the women who we've been able to come across in our project. And as Kiana said, we are coming across more and more names. And as we do this project, because it's a community project, and we have worked with historical societies, libraries, churches, community groups, families, that we are getting more and more information and names as we move along, which is wonderful. And so I just wanted to show this slide because these are the women who are also part of that generation, making contributions, and they represent all parts of Connecticut, and demonstrates the role that Connecticut has in this moment in history, in the stories. This particular project, as I said, and I'll close here, that this particular project has 3 phases, and we are at the very end of the last phase. It was our goal to be able to share with you the traveling exhibit that we are working, are having created at this moment. We will have a 4-banner traveling exhibit based on this project and the women who are featured in this project. That will be housed at the Connecticut Historical Society. So perhaps this summer you want to work with CHS and rent out the exhibition for your town or a school group or something to talk about wonderful history of women of color activists in our state. And so if you have any information, if you come across someone or you may have something that you are interested in, please contact us. If you go to the website that's here, one of the things that the Connecticut Historical Society committed to is to allowing this project to live on their website. And that was one of the things that just took this project to another level. And it's just wonderful. And I'm just so grateful for the partnership. If you have anything that you think we need to take a look at, please contact us through our community input form that you can complete right off the main website here, WOC votes. Just want to say thank you again for the partnership with the Connecticut Historical Society. Karen and Eileen, we've been at this for over 2 years, and I just couldn't think of anyone else to do it with. I appreciate the partnership. And of course, Chelsea and Kiana, your contribution has been invaluable to the project. And of course, we just thank everyone, including, we thank the League for the investment. And also just want to give a shout out to Katie and the work that she's doing, that this whole grant has been amazing and it allowed us to really accomplish a goal and really being able to spark some great conversations that are happening across the state. So.
Thank you so much, Brittany. That was great. And I'm going to, that was a terrific segue for me to say, go visit the Capitol and see the new plaque. We were hoping to have a dedication ceremony in person. That's still on the agenda at some point. The Capitol's not fully open yet, but go visit the Capitol plaque and then go visit the Historical Society. It's kind of like a twofer. You can go visit Hartford. And I can definitely say that a bunch of us that are in the audience remember combing through the basement of the League when we moved from our old office in Dixwell Avenue to our new one in Washington Avenue, and all of the treasures that we found there, among a lot of other kind of icky things, but definitely some interesting stuff. And most of our stuff has been moved to the Connecticut archives now. So the library there, because there's some, it's amazing what you'll find in a basement, that's for sure. We do have a couple of questions already in the chat. And if you have other questions, please put them in. I think one of the first question I noticed from Manisha is she enjoyed the presentation. Katie, can you speculate on why Rebecca Prime's activism remained hidden so long, and why wasn't it acknowledged when she died?
All right, so thank you, Professor Sinha, for that question. Of course, she's my advisor. I appreciate it. Yeah, so there are several reasons for this, I think, about why the records did not come to light, why her life has not been as prominently featured as it seems it should be in the history of Hartford. One of those reasons was just the circumstances of her life and death. So at the end of Rebecca Primus Thomas's life, she is, as I said, 95 years old. She lives the remaining years of her life in destitution. She outlives all of her close family. So when she's buried in the Primus family plot at the Zion Hill Cemetery, it is likely due to fundraising or support from the Talcott Street Church that funds that funeral. I know one of her living relatives was her niece and her niece's children. I know that woman worked also as a teacher, but left the state to pursue work opportunities. So I think part of the reason it was just the destitution in which she lived, that she wasn't as prominent in her later years. The other reason, I think, is because the records of the Talcott Street Congregational Church, which is now Faith Congregational Church in Hartford, have largely been lost. And this is partially due to just the natural progression of records not being kept or preserved properly, but also because Faith Congregational Church, when it moved from Talcott Street to its current location on Main Street, experienced a devastating fire in 1959. So the majority of the records that were housed there that had, that could speak to the 19th century and in the early period of the church of existence were lost, that were there, or as Professor Yancey has said, are in homes of different members or passed down generations. And it is not really until Farrah Griffin does these transcriptions of the letters in the 1990s that people are more aware of this collection and these papers. So I think a combination of those factors led to her life being not as prominent. But of course, as this research shows and the work of other scholars, these are the stories that need to be highlighted because they do speak, they shift the lens away from what we commonly see represented to this other community nexus of women who are working to enact change in a variety of unique and creative ways as well.
Notice that she did not have a headstone.
Yes, she does not have a
That
headstone.
photo that you showed, I was like, wait, she doesn't have it. So that makes
Yes. I'm also speculating that that's where her body is laying, just because of the layout of the Primus family plot. But yeah, she doesn't even have a headstone. So, and of course, many scholars also who look for records of her life only look for Primus, which is her maiden name. They don't look for, and she went by Thomas the rest of her life, which is a much less common name. So those factors are also a part of the reason why she's not as prominent. But again, as Professor Yancey was saying, this is part of this journey of research into history that has not been preserved in the same way or given as much attention.
Okay, I think Leslie's Heffel-McGurk's question, I think about a phase 3. Professor Yancey's team, are you aware of other states that are working on this type of project? Also, do you have a phase 3 in mind? So that's kind of a two-part question.
So I invite Karen and Eileen to join me in answering this question. The centennial anniversary sparked a lot of research, and there are several states. One of the states that we did come across, I want to say it was Kentucky, because we were looking at other states that may have also been doing similar projects. And they did a fascinating project. And Kentucky actually is connected to the work of Nanny Burroughs. She was doing some work down that way. And so I believe that inspired the work that they were doing. And so they have a really nice digital archive website where they highlight local women of color who were on the ground, again, perhaps not self-identifying themselves as suffragists, but committed to the voting rights struggle and reformers and activists in their own right. And so absolutely, I think I would say coming out of 2020, we've seen groups really raise up this question about, how do you tell this history in a more inclusive way, where you're broadening the timeline, where you're widening it to demonstrate the different ways in which women, and particularly women of color, are advancing these questions of citizenship, of justice, of democracy at the turn of the 20th century, and taking up intersectional agendas that are also part of what we would identify as this suffrage period, but more part of a broader kind of struggle for voting rights. So Eileen and Karen, I'm not sure in terms of those that are in the museum world, how the museums and historical societies are taking up this. I would imagine the public history side of this has advanced quite a bit on highlighting women who are oftentimes overlooked. I don't know if any of you wanted to share.
Great. Next question is from Patricia Boyd. First and foremost, congrats to all of you who have worked hard on this project. To unearth the Black women participation in the Connecticut League, Mary Ann Carey wanted to put the names of Black women on the Declaration of the Rights of Women, and the answer was no. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, she believe the year is going to escape me in this moment. I want to say it was in 1870s or in the 1880s, Mary Ann Shad Carey, when I was looking at Katie's project and she was talking about Frances Harper. I mean, these are like heavy hitters, right? Like these are women who are oftentimes overlooked in our history, but they are writers, they are activists, reformers, suffragists, and they are asking hardcore questions in this moment in history. And Mary Ann Shad Carey, this is a woman who is, she runs her own newspaper. She is part of the suffrage movement. She aligns herself, and she's asking the question of adding African-American women. And she gets, I believe, 94 African-American women to sign on, that want to sign on to the Declaration of Sentiments, and they deny it. And this is something that needs to be said, that when we talk about the role in which African-American women not only organize amongst themselves, some of them continue to work within these predominantly white circles in the face of racism, right? They understand, and they continue to move on because they understand, as Mary Seymour says, the work must be done. And they face it, and they take it on. And I think she's a great example of that. Mary Church Terrell is also a very great example of that. This is a woman who was also picketing outside of the White House, right? When they went out, knowing that she was the only Black woman out there, facing, going, toe to toe and taking it all in, recognizing that there's a larger goal to be had here. And so, there's all types of ways of answering that, but she did petition, and that petition was denied.
Unfortunate. Any other questions out there? I don't see any more. I'm going to I'm going to read Carol's question out loud. I think you answered it to her privately, but I think it's a really good point. Will you be bringing any of this research to communities of color directly, perhaps at churches or other organizations? And that's from Carol Reimers. And of course, absolutely. That's what the banners are, right? The banners are the main thing we're waiting on. So it sounds like it's really going to be an exciting project to take on the road. Okay.
I just do want to say these two projects, Katie and I, we had the pleasure of working with Faith Congregational, and a lot of these churches do know about the project. I think because of COVID, I think everyone's kind of just playing it safe. I do know a couple of the churches in New Haven very much interested, but because of COVID have just kind of step back. I do think that both of these projects need more exploration. Both of the goals of the project are certainly ones that we want to continue on and share for sure. So if you know of anyone that's interested, or please reach out to us. But hopefully there'll be a time where we'll be able to take it into some of these community institutions that have helped us bring these projects together.
That's terrific. It's really great work that you've all done. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. And thank everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you'll check out our website, lwvct.org. We have lots of advocacy action going on. There is so much going on right now. There's a short session. We're working on some voting rights stuff that we want to share with you. And of course, we'll be bringing you some more information about what's going to be on the ballot this year, as well as debates for the candidates. Once we get going, it's a pretty busy year for all of us. And we definitely we're so glad that we were able to participate in this project and help you guys bring this to fruition, because it's very important that we all remember where we came from, because women and women of color, we were there the whole time. We just weren't counted. So we all need to be counted. And thank you so much, everyone. And there's a lot of thank yous in the chat. And thank you to Rachel, who's been monitoring the tech for us. And we all appreciate all the work that you do. And thanks everyone for being in the league and part of the league, and go out there and tell everyone about this project, as well as the whole thing, everything. Women, voting rights, we all want to be part of it, and we need to make knowledge is power. So we all need to own up to what we had in our history and make it better. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.